Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I think there we go. Picture showed up. That's my wife, Jenna, and our four kids, Aria, Colette, Eden, and Silas. And they're still in France, finishing up the school year. I came back a little bit earlier to be able to visit some of our friends and partners in ministry and to be able to be here with you today. And so they'll be joining me next Sunday, and then we'll begin a 2-month sabbatical. So we're really looking forward to that. But it's a joy to be here with you this morning. Obviously, I've known Grant and Brittany for a long time, and I was really on my way here reminding myself, what stories can I share about Grant and throw some shade on him a little bit? And there was none. It was kind of frustrating, because he has all these stories on me. But that just kind of gives you a testimony of Grant and Brittany. It's just steady, faithful, patient, loving people. And that's the gift you have here in this church. And so it's just been a joy to watch the story of this church develop along with ours at the same time. So I follow you all from a distance. I read your newsletters. And so it's exciting to see what God's doing here. And it's a blessing to be here with you in person this morning. So a little bit about our family and our story. If we move to the next slide, you can even continue on. We first started out in Ivory Coast, West Africa. We spent 2 years in France learning French because we were going to go to Ivory Coast, which is a French-speaking country, along with 110 other languages. And we began learning our second language upon arrival, and I was doing theological education. We were training pastors to plant churches in an unreached people group called the Jula, about 2 million people with zero access to the gospel. And so my wife was engaged in community health evangelism as a nurse, equipping people with just the health needs, but at the same time sharing the gospel through the images of the body that God provides us. And so we were there for 6 months, having the time of our lives. And then there was an unexpected turn with our daughter, Colette, who's on the back of Jenna's back there. And she ended up having a brain seizure and kidney failure in the middle of northern Ivory Coast. And so that led us on a long journey of finally getting to Paris, where we were evacuated and spent a month in the ICU. She was in a coma for 10 days, and then God in his grace just brought her out of it. He healed her brain, but not her kidneys. And so God killed my dream of missions in Africa, and he began to move me on mission with what he wanted to do with our family. And it was one of those moments where you're like, I thought you were always the one controlling things, but it was really me. And now he just brings me on into what he was doing. And so through that, he then moved us to Strasbourg, France. And so that's where we've been these last 8 years. We've started up a Business for Transformation initiative, which just really is short for a coffee shop that serves its neighborhood, right? We have a coffee shop in a kind of Muslim majority context. We got more than 70 nationalities that live in our neighborhood of about 25,000 people. And we've been planting a church there through this coffee shop. And so the coffee shop provides jobs. We do job training for refugees and migrants, and we also provide actual jobs for them. Right now we have a Ukrainian refugee, a South African guy, and a French person that's going to be heading to Morocco as a missionary soon. And just glad to be able to provide jobs for good people, but also job training skills. We also do French classes. We currently have 175 students in our French classes every trimester, and also some women's art workshops that we do. That was a little French pause there, sorry. You're going to get a lot of those today, I think. And so that just gives us an opportunity to just bless women and a lot of other different things, to just be able to make bridges of trust strong enough to support the weight of the truth, right? That's what we're trying to do, because you got people that are far from Jesus. How do you connect with them without some relationship in place? And the cafe provides that. And so through that, we've been able to plant a French-speaking multicultural church, about 12 nationalities. And then we've also been able to accompany the planting of a Farsi-speaking church, which is like Iran, Afghanistan. We've baptized more than 35 people from Iran and Afghanistan. And also, we've been able to help train and send out 5 French missionaries, which is just mind-blowing, because they have all churches, 70 people, and on top of that, we have no money. And so it's just been awesome to watch God send people to Muslim-majority context in North Africa, in Western Africa, in Mayotte, and in Lebanon. And so just a blessing to be a part of this. I really just feel like I'm just getting a front-row seat to watching what God does. It's been great. However, we thought we were done in West Africa, and God's like, no, I still have a role for you in West Africa. And so we've been partnering with a church planting organization in West Africa. We've been able to identify 8 West African countries and leaders, and 5 of them have been trained and evaluated as directors to be able to continue the work of training church planters. And we have 5 in Ivory Coast, where we were at, that are planting churches amongst the Jula people that we went to reach. And then also we have 34 West Africans in church planter training right now in those 8 countries. And so I'll be heading to Benin in October to continue that process of training these directors. And pretty soon, I'll be working myself out of a job, and they'll be just off to the races with it. So God's been gracious in allowing us to be a part of it from a distance. And so that's been great. However, we're moving into a new season, our transition, and so we're transitioning to a different kind of ministry. First of all, a transition from a neighborhood to a city. That's a picture of Strasbourg. Roughly 500,000 people live in the metropolis there. And that's the breakup of our neighborhoods. And those little red dots are all the evangelical churches in Strasbourg. And those 2 orange dots, the 2 churches that we've been able to help plant while they're in Strasbourg. And you'll see there's nothing in the western side of Strasbourg because that's where all the Muslims live. And you'll see there's nothing in the northeastern part of Strasbourg because that's where all the wealthy, rich people live from the European Court of Human Rights. It's just ironic that the 2 people that are neglected or unwilling to hear the gospel are the wealthy, who make it's really difficult for the wealthy to enter into the kingdom because it's like putting a camel through the eye of a needle. And then also at the same time, the fear of embracing the people from the Muslim majority world. And so we have decided to move in the western direction. So our church plant is the orange dot on the west. And we planted there critically to be able to begin to move into those other neighborhoods. And so that's kind of what we'll be doing in this next season. If we go to the next slide. This is our Strasbourg team up on the top. That's our missionary team. So I have the joy of leading them and just getting the chance to encourage them. And so this next season, I'll be decreasing our work in the church, but we're continuing to teach and preach, but also get a chance to coach and welcome our elders and new Cafe K67 is the name of our coffee shop. And so I'll be helping mentor and coach them in this next season as we have one of our elders that's going to become a vocational elder. And so he is going to continue that work, and I'll be with him, and also our director of our community center to be able to continue that work as well. And then we're onboarding 7 new missionary units, so that's singles and families that are coming to join us to begin the work of planting new churches in these other neighborhoods. So we'll be working with them to develop a church planting strategy for this next season, and so that's a lot of what my work will be. The picture on the bottom is the elders of our church, and so you can see some of them and their wives. We have a South African, myself, a French guy, another American friend that are there in the photo. So just it's been a joy to do life with them. Also, I'll be moving into another role, transitioning. In the next slide, you'll see from the neighborhoods to the nations. And so I'm going to be taking on a new role on a global scale with a new agency, and they have work happening all over the world, as you can kind of see on the map there. And my new role is going to be one of caring and coaching for new leaders. In the next slide, you'll see kind of what we're heading towards, just providing care and coaching for the leaders of these teams. One of the biggest causes of missionary attrition is the fact that there's unhealthy teams. And so if we have healthy leaders, we're more likely to have healthy teams. And so to invest in those guys and their families is going to be a way we can help do that. And so that's one of our main roles in this next season. Also training new sent missionaries, sent ones, that will be working on developing a system of training as well. And then developing the network amongst new people and new places around the world. So I'll get the joy of being like Barnabas, who gets to go and say, wow, the hand of the Lord is here. Let's send some workers. Let's go get Saul and bring him over. And so that's really what I get the joy of being a part of, is just to see the grace of God, to draw people into that purpose, and to be able to connect the sending and the receiving churches. And so how do we connect an American church with a work in Japan or in Sweden or in Italy, and them to begin to have a beautiful partnership? And so that's kind of what that will look like in this next season. So renewal and mission is what I really get to be a part of, and it's a joy. On the next slide, you'll see our agency. It's a new agency called Upstream Sending. It's been only around for 4 years, but they've also existed for 10 years, but primarily in equipping local churches, and now they're beginning to send. And so Upstream kind of functions like an airplane. If you look at this next picture, we've got a sending network and a field network is what we would call it. And so our motto is the church sends and we help. And so whenever a missionary comes to us and says, we want to be a missionary, we're like, awesome, but we want to see if your church is behind you. We want to help them send you. And so we have a sending network of churches that churches join this, and it creates a collective of churches, of mission-minded people that want to learn how to send together. It's a learning community where they can learn to send their people better. And then they send them to the field network, which is where I'll be at on the other side of the world, taking the different folks from our team leaders, encouraging them, and beginning to connect the dots. And so now it's church-to-church relationship, and the agency gets out of the way and facilitates relationship between churches. And so that's where we're heading in this new season. and it's really exciting to be a part of this next season. So if you want to look at ways you can partner with us, one of the ways is just to check out Upstream Collective resources so we can equip churches. You don't have to send anyone through Upstream, but just to be a church is trying to figure out how do we send missionaries and do that well. They're a great set of resources available. You can join our ministry partners with us. You'll see there's a little card out on the front table if you want to join us in financial partnership. We'd love that, but mostly through prayer. So the prayer is the deep work of the ministry that we've seen God do in Strasbourg, and I love reading your updates about how you guys are praying intentionally as a church. And so, yes, if you'd like to pray with us, feel free to send me an email, and I'd love to connect you and get you on our newsletter as you're available. And lastly, just connect these resources and feel free to share this work with other folks so they can bless other churches in as much as possible. So that's a little bit about our story and what we've been up to and what God's been up to in our lives in this last season. But it's actually nothing new, right? This is just what he's been up to for like the last 2,000 years, and we're just getting a little look into what it looks like in one little part of the world. And so what's hard, though, and makes this a struggle for us, is to stay focused on what God is up to in the world. That's where it's hard, right? And I know this because I grew up in rural western Pennsylvania, where there's more cows than people. Think Appalachia, West Virginia culture a little bit, right? I've come a long ways. And I was working with my dad in construction, and I learned a lot with my dad in construction. And one of the things that my dad always had to fight for was staying focused. Because when you're a small, independent businessman in construction, you are the employer, you are the employee, you are the bookkeeper, and you are the secretary, all at the same time. And so you're up on a ladder pounding something, and you get a phone call from the guy in the next job that wants to know when you're going to be there. He hangs up, and he's like, what was I doing? And he forgets. And so he had this little phrase that he would tell himself. He would be like, stay on point, Eric. Stay on point. He would just be mumbling it to himself. I'm like, he's crazy, So yes, kids, your dads may be crazy, but there's a reason sometimes, right? And so sometimes I'd get distracted, like, stay on point, Justin. And this was kind of his phrase that he would always do. And so it's interesting because I think this is something that's really helped me in my own life and ministry. And I think it's something that's really important for us as the church. Are we staying on point with the mission that God has entrusted us with? And so as we are God's people who have been saved, who've been sent with a purpose to engage in his mission to the world, we've been given this mission of multiplication and maturity. These are two values for Upstream, is how do we focus on multiplication and maturity at the same time? And both of these are needed for healthy mission. And this morning, we're going to have a little bit greater focus on the multiplication aspect. But I think what we're going to see is that a mature church multiplies, and it's not mature if it can't or doesn't. And so both are essential. And so sometimes we have to just kind of sit back from time to time and ask ourselves, are we staying on point with Christ's mission of multiplication and maturity? Are we off track? And how do we need to get back in line with what God has us here on earth for? And so something this morning, I want us to take some time just to ask ourselves some questions based upon a section from the book of Acts that shows the church on mission in a distinct moment of time, but I think represents a mature church on mission for us today as well. And so there's 5 questions that this passage is going to raise for us as we go through it to ask ourselves if we as the church are staying on point with the mission of God that he's invited us to join him on. And so before we begin, I kind of want to set the stage for Acts chapter 11 because just before this, we have chapter 10. And if you're not familiar, this is when Peter has this vision of animals all together. It's a really weird story, but to summarize it, he's saying God has now revealed that non-Jews are now first-class citizens in the kingdom of God. No one is second class. No one sits in economy. We're all in first class. And so this first 18 verses of chapter 11 that we didn't read, we see the summary of what they say amongst the elders in Jerusalem in verse 17 and 18, where it says, if then God gave the same gift to them as he gave to us when we believed in Lord Jesus Christ, who was I that I could stand in God's way? When they heard these things, they fell silent. And they glorified God, saying, then to the Gentiles also God has granted repentance that leads to life. A beautiful moment in the turning point of the opening up from the people of God as being a Jewish people to a multi-ethnic community. And so what's going on here in Jerusalem is interesting, but there's actually a movement of God that's taking place prior to this moment. Because right after verse 18, we have verse 19 that we read. Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. And so you'd think like, wait, did they hear what just happened in verse 18? Did they not know that now it can go to everybody? Well, it's because they didn't know. They didn't know what was going on because actually Luke is rewinding the story for us and saying actually these people who left, they had no information, no update, no social media campaign to know that the gospel is going to the Gentiles right now. So that we go back to chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. We'll see it on the screen here. This is what we learn. Luke is taking us back here. Saul was there giving approval to his death, the death of Stephen. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church of Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. And so, while Peter is explaining his vision to the apostles and elders in Jerusalem, God's already been up to something in having scattered his people who went out and started preaching the transforming news of Jesus everywhere they went. They didn't get the update on Peter's vision. They weren't included in the TikTok video, right? And so they take off and they end up in Antioch. And this is where we pick up in verses 19 to 30 to see what God's doing in Antioch with these people who have no idea of what God's been doing in Jerusalem. And so it's important to keep this narrative in our head as we move into our passage this morning. So the first question that I want us to ask as we are assessing if we're staying on mission or not is, number one, do we recognize whose mission it is? Right? We see this wording in Luke that kind of helps give us some indications. He says, the hand of the Lord was with them. And how Barnabas had seen the grace of the Lord was with them. This is none other than the work of God in and through his people. This isn't the mission of the apostles, the mission of the elders, or the church, or anyone other than the Lord of the church who promised that he would build his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. This is the mission of God, not the mission of the church. It's his mission. And so much so that not even persecution would stop it, but it would actually propel it forward. It's crazy as we begin to see Satan who's actively trying to destroy the church. If we go back even further to Acts chapter 4, we can see a progression that takes place. Right? There's persecution in chapter 4 with the imprisonment of Peter and John right after the birth of the church. The authorities kind of step in and they realize, man, we're actually going to not be able to stop them from preaching the word, so they have to release them and let them go. Which leads to Satan trying to impede the growth of the church through self-promotion. With chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira trying to lie about their spirituality and get promotions in front of the people of God. And it seems like it's going to circumvent the mission of the church. But the elders are wise, and through careful, gentle discipline, they're able to put them to correction. And so Satan is on the move again, though, because we get to chapter 6, and we've got division. The neglect of the Greek-speaking widows, and there's this fight about who's getting what distributed, and the others are like, we need to put deacons in place because we just can't do it all, right? And so they put them in place, and the division subsides. But then Satan finally gets fed up with it all, and he goes right for the jugular in chapter 7. Direct destruction. We're just going to stone Stephen. And just when you think mission's dying, chapter 8, mission actually explodes. The people go, and we see how God is unleashing his plan into action through persecution. And all of a sudden, you have a church that gets planted and believers coming out of nowhere in Antioch. Who but God gets that done? That's the only way that's possible. And so as we assess if we are staying on point or not as a church, we have to ask ourselves, whose mission is this? Whether it is the mission of God in your life or the life of the church. Who runs the work that you're getting after? Is it God? Is it someone, something else? Because I think I can speak for the elders and say that they know that it doesn't depend on them. They're just responsible for equipping you to take your place in the mission that God has for Franklin City Church, right? But are we doing the work as we depend on God, or are we depending upon the latest method, the newest book, the greatest strategy that just kind of came out? Because we're trying to expect that God's going to somehow grow the church through those mechanisms other than the gospel, the faithful preaching of his word, and the gathering of believers. Because it doesn't matter what you have or what you don't have. It doesn't matter how big and glorious your building or your budget is or isn't. Because you can have all those things, and you can actually push God right out of the picture. And so I think we have to begin by asking ourselves, are we relying more on our giftedness and our resources, or on our brokenness and our dependence? Relying more on our efforts and our methods, or our need of him to act if anything is going to happen amongst us. Because while the bigwigs are hanging out in Jerusalem, strategizing and coming to terms with the Gentiles being allowed to become a part of the church, there's a whole other group of people, part of the church, that are beginning to preach the gospel to the Gentiles, seeing them come to Jesus, and forming a church in Antioch. And this is why the gospel broke the cultural sound barrier between Jews and Gentiles, not because of some human manufactured strategy, but a God-ordained movement. And so, folks, you're probably committed to some really good missions and causes. I hope you are, right? But I hope that it's not at the expense of the great commission of the resurrected Christ, right? Somehow, our little missions and causes help us contribute to the larger mission of what Christ is after, right? Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men. He's given each of us a lake, a pond, or some of us an ocean where we get to go fishing. He just says, be faithful where I've placed you. And so, you are probably committed to these things, and I hope so. And I hope we're not completely off point. But the question is whose mission are we on this morning? This brings us to our second question, which is, who did he do it with? Who is on mission here in this text? You'll see in verses 19 and 20 that there's this group of people who ended up in Antioch, but who is it? It's men from Cyprus and Cyrene. Cyprus is an island off of Turkey and Greece. It's part Turkish, part Greek. And Cyrene is actually Libya. And today, North Africa. So you got a group of Turks and a group of North African Libyans that are taking the gospel to Antioch. And so here we see that this is a launch pad for the movement of God into uncharted territory. It's this group of unauthorized Africans and Turks from Pentecost, who were probably at Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2 when the Spirit comes down and they're hearing about what God is up to through the apostles. They believed, and now all of a sudden they land in Antioch, not having had any visions like Peter, but just simply not being able to contain the good news of Jesus for themselves. They just had to give it away. They're just delighted to share it with everyone they meet. But again, this is without formal authorization, without theologically trained personnel. There's no professors, there's no formally trained pastors, but people transformed by God and walking obediently with him. But it took everyone, even Turks and Libyans. There's no visionary, omnicompetent Grant who comes in and plants the church in Antioch, right? There's no great pastor figure that comes in and does it. We don't get names, we just get nouns. Some dudes from North Africa, right? And Luke loves names, but he doesn't even care. It's just some people. We don't even know who they are. And so up until now, it was just Jewish people preaching from Jewish scriptures, telling Jewish people to follow Jesus, who was a Jewish Messiah. And now the reality of Antioch is that we have people as far as from probably Persia and maybe from China that were in Antioch at this moment. An incredibly diverse city. And now all of a sudden, because of some faithful, ordinary believers like you and I, they're changed. They weren't preaching from platforms and pulpits, right? They're preaching in grocery stores, in parks, in cubicles, and around the dinner table, just like us. And so it took these people, everyday natural believers, doing this. And so what I'm not saying this morning is that professional Christians and pastors that are trained are not needed. No, we need more trained pastors and healthy pastors than ever, if you've read the news recently, right? I'm just saying that they're not enough. It's just not enough. Because pastors, they don't go to your workplace, right? Youth pastors and youth leaders, they don't go to your school's kids, right? Parents, we don't have any missionaries going to sit in the stands of your sports events and your kids' activities. Only you are there. Only you can reach that lake, that pond, that ocean. I can't. I live in France. You live in Franklin. And so I'm not here to reach them. Only you can do that. But we can only do that when each and every one of us is engaged in his mission. And so, are we on mission? Or are we just playing church on Sunday morning? We see it, right? I watch my kids play with baby dolls sometimes, and they're playing house. And sometimes I feel like at my own church, it's like, are we just playing church or are we living this out? It gets hard, right? Are we living into this reality of every man, woman, and child on mission for King Jesus? And what's interesting as I get more and more involved in missions is the rise of what's called marketplace ministers in global missions. We're seeing increasing numbers of business professionals, students, engineers, tech people going into unreached countries in a way that no missionary ever could enter. For example, I have a friend who's working in the hospitality industry in North Africa, not far from Libya, and he is the only missionary in his city. He's been there for 5 years, but he's the only Westerner who's been able to make it and stay there because all the other missionaries have been expelled from the country. But because of his status, he's been able to stay. Or my friend Tim, who lives in Kentucky, and he gets the chance to travel to China every other month to be able to go and work with business partners, and he's beginning to see gospel fruit take place through these relationships. I met Brian this morning, who's got colleagues in Fergusheim, France, which is just 10 minutes down the road from me. It's like he's got access to folks in France and Japan or wherever else, just all over the world. It's beautiful to see how we've got our fingertips in these places and how can we use these relationships to be involved around the world. Ordinary people living ordinary lives with gospel intentionality. How could we use our profession, our jobs, to be able to begin to move around the world for his glory? It's very simple, right? It just means doing the chores, having meals, watching sports, going to work with the intention to talk about Jesus, to pastor people with the gospel, and to share him with others. Right? But if we're going to stay on point, we all have to be engaged. Thirdly, where is mission taking place? As we move into the next section of the narrative we see here in verses 27 through 30, something really interesting begins to take place. There's a famine that gets announced that takes place, and the church in Antioch raises to the occasion to help who? The mother church, right? They're actually going back to Jerusalem to be able to help the mother church who's facing a crisis. And they start to realize that actually the church is bigger than just Jerusalem. It actually consists of Antioch now. And now there's this larger global church reality that becomes evident. And now the small little fledgling church in Antioch starts to give back to the mother church. And so I think this starts to speak to our own reality of the church today. And this is why my third question is where is mission taking place? Or maybe better, from where is mission taking place? Because what we realize that missions has grown into our day, it's what a Latin American theologian has called missions from everywhere to everywhere. It's no longer missions from the west to the rest, but literally we're seeing what's called polycentric mission. We're seeing these centers open up all over the world where now we're actually starting to see Brazilians and Koreans and Philippines sending more or as many missionaries as Americans. It's unbelievable to see how God is sending Filipino women who are doing house care sent to Saudi Arabia for kings and princes to care for their children, and they're actually beginning to have access to Saudi Arabian prince families and share the gospel with kids because they don't want to take care of their kids. And maybe we're going to see gospel seeds planted and Saudi Arabian princes or future princes come to know Jesus. It's unbelievable because of some Filipino women that decide to give themselves up for God's mission. It's no longer just an American reality. If we stuck all the Christians of the world into this one room, the average person would not look like a white male. It would be an African woman. Because we've seen the epicenter of the kingdom of God shift to Africa, and it's well on its way to Asia. It's beautiful, but it's challenging. And it kind of shocks our mentalities of what we think about when we think about the global church. And so it's very interesting because as we begin to answer this question of mission from everywhere to everywhere, we have to start to really reconsider, what is our place in this new global reality? We have to reorganize our thoughts around transformational relationships and not just one-sided giving. And so we start to think about the global church. We have to think about these new dynamics. And so we don't just have something to give, but we actually have something to receive. We have something to learn from the global church. So what could this look like? Well, I think just like Paul and Barnabas, as they were sent out as mediators of the resources to the Jerusalem church, this is one of the roles I get to play in this next season of helping create relationships between gospel partner churches and have relationships between like-minded churches that live in different parts of the world. And so the dream being that there could be reciprocal and life-giving relationships between these like-minded churches. For example, Franklin City Church has develops a relationship with a church in France. And you send us some people that we can disciple and we can encourage, and we send them back to you, and they can continue to help you do the good work that you're doing. And then we have a young couple that's actually going to be coming in September to Ohio to work with one of our churches, and they're going to be discipled and encouraged and blessed, and they're going to be sent back to be able to plant a church with us. And they're going to be planting that church, and that church is going to be able to support and encourage them. But what's interesting is that in France, we are far, far ahead of you in terms of secularism, right? We're actually past post-Christianity. We're almost going to a pre-Christian reality, where we have a new generation of people that have no bearings for what in the world Christianity is. Atheism is on the down, and spirituality is on the rise, and people are thirsty and ready. And so we're going to be able to come back and teach the American church that is rapidly deconstructing its faith, entering into the season that we already have been doing for the last 50 years. And there's going to be some things that this church planter is going to go back and teach Ohioans on how to reach this new generation. It's life-giving reciprocal partnerships. Or my friend in Avon, Indiana, yesterday was talking about the tons of Muslims that are moving into his area and partnering with a West African church planter. And how are you guys reaching Muslims in your part of the world? And how could we learn and benefit from you? And so all of a sudden, it's not just one-sided giving, but reciprocal relationships. They won't have a lot of money to give you, but they will have a lot of learning and experience that I think we can share from. And so there's a lot we can learn here, but the question is, does the church here have ears to hear and relationships in place to engage in conversation? That's why these partnerships are important. There's so much more that we could say on that front, but if we're going to be a church on mission, we have to be engaged. Actually, we get to be engaged in the global church, just as it is in the world, and not just our own little patch of land here in the U.S. Thankfully, we are making a shift as Americans where for decades we were only sending money. Missions was something that happened over there. And we've made the shift back to like, oh, no, wait, we've got to take care of our own cities and towns, and we've got some work to do locally. But in that process, we swung the pendulum here, and now we're seeing churches neglect global missions. And so how can we keep them both together, right? That's what this text is inviting us to do together. So as we think about staying on point with the mission of God he's given us, we have to ask ourselves, where are we finding ourselves involved in the world? Both as a church, but also as individuals and families. I've loved hearing some stories about people involved in El Salvador and going to Japan and new places. I'm sure you guys are partnering with other folks. It's beautiful to hear what God's doing. And so we all have a role to play and learn from each other. And I hope that's what we can see happen. Fourth question, why are we on mission? At the end of the day, why are we here? I think we could absolutely say that it's for the glory of God. Absolutely. But the point that the text wants to make here is that the church doesn't exist for herself. She exists for God, and she exists for his glory, but she does that through the multiplication of disciples, leaders, and churches, because as people are transformed in the image of Christ, the glory of the Lord fills the earth as the waters covers the sea. Habakkuk 2 vision. It's not this that God's glory is just going to go out magically, but it gets in us, and we go, and this multiplication of the image of God spreads, and we see that take place. And so now what we have to do is we're going to skip to the next phase of the church in Antioch that we haven't read yet. We're going to get to Acts chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, which should be up here on the screen. Now, there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers. Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a lifelong friend of Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul, a credibly diverse leadership team. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work with which I have given them." Then after fasting and praying, they laid their hands on them and sent them off. So the goal is more communities transformed by the person of Jesus. And this is exactly what we see taking place. Now all of a sudden, this little church plant that was started by some unknown North Africans and Turks is now a launch pad for sending God's people out in the world. You don't see the church shrinking in on itself like some kind of social club, but it's actually exploding outwardly into the world. And this is what we see, the first ever intentional missionary sending service. Can't you wait for the day when Franklin City Church sends its first missionary out? Or your first church plant? I can't wait for that. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, right? We're just waiting for that. We're being faithful in this time. It's beautiful. And so the capacity of the church is not found in its ability to gather, but in its ability to scatter and to reproduce itself for the spreading of the gospel and establishing of new and healthy churches. To use the language of J.D. Greear, we don't want to be known for our seating capacity, but for our sending capacity, right? All these seats are full, okay, but who are we sending out? And so if we're losing people to the kingdom of God, that's okay, right? Because his kingdom's growing, even if my little kingdom is shrinking. And it's worth it, right? And this comes at a great cost. We've experienced it in France, like the Antioch Church. We sent out our best members to continue the work of spreading the gospel. And it's devastating. Gospel goodbyes are terrible, right? But they're absolutely glorious at the same time. And so this is what the church does, though, because that's why we exist, for the spreading of his glory, not ours. And so we need to gather, we need to pray and study the word, be edified for this kind of stuff to happen, because that's what they're doing. They're praying, they're studying, they're seeking the Lord in this time, and then they begin to scatter to unleash the force of God's missional people so that we can glorify him by establishing communities of light all over the world. And so this leads us to our final question. At what cost does the mission go forward? In the case of Antioch, it cost them three things: their preferences, their people, and their possessions. In 11:26, we read this: in Antioch, the disciples were first called Christians. We see here that they had to figure out how to live out a diverse church because they're no longer just Jews or Gentiles, but they're Christians, right? They're no longer defined by their ethnic or cultural, linguistic heritage, but by their new spiritual address. We're in Christ. We have no idea what to call them because everything is divided by race and culture and language. But now there's this like no longer monolithic thing, but this beautiful multicultural thing. We don't know what to call it, so we're going to call it Christian. It was actually a pejorative term. It's funny that we now use a pejorative term for our days about Christians, but they're these Christians. The folly of following a crucified Messiah. Unbelievable. And so if you're going to lean into that diversity, that means you're going to have to give up some preferences at a given point. Then we come to 27 to 30, where we see the cost them their possessions. They sought to raise funds to help the Jerusalem church. Everyone gave according to their means. In Acts chapter 13, as we just read, we saw that it cost them their people by willing to send their own members to see the spread of the gospel to unreached people and places. And folks, this is gospel-driven hospitality and generosity. This was not forced upon them. It wasn't demanded by the elders putting in the budget or by the Harbor Network who says you got to give a certain percentage maybe to church planting. But they gave up their comfort, their money, their human resources for the furtherance of the kingdom. Releasing our preferences, our people, and our possessions for the kingdom is hard. But this is actually what the gospel does, right? Jesus gave up his preferences in leaving heaven to come towards us. So we don't have to drum up the desire to do hospitality and try harder, but actually we just have to remember how Christ was hospitable to us and how he released his preferences to welcome our brokenness into family proximity, right? What hospitality. That makes me want to give up my desire, my preferences for the sake of others because I've experienced that. I can now do it to others. Or the Father who didn't hold back his people, but he gave his very best to an only son to come move amongst us. A release of the very best, his own son, to die on a cross. And Jesus, who didn't just give us scraps and leftovers of possessions, but he gave us everything. He gave us his own life on the cross. He held nothing back, and this is what opens up our hands and releases our preferences, our people, and possessions when we experience the renewing grace of Jesus Sunday in and Sunday out, city group meeting after city group meeting, prayer time after prayer time. We're renewing in this so we can release our people, our possessions, and preferences for the cause of Jesus. It's so important. And so what cost will Franklin City Church and each person and family commit to this endeavor? Because it's going to hit hard. This preaches well, but it lives hard, right? To be a church on mission with God, it means we're going to have to sacrifice our preferences and certain desires and working with different cultures that maybe start to show up or ethnicities that come in, generations and socioeconomic statuses. It might mean being part of that city group where the people are different from you. Or inviting that neighbor to join your group. Like, no, their family culture is so twisted and broken. I don't want to invite that into my family, right? We had an Indian woman that was in our house one time, and we saw the lice jumping on her head, right? And our house was covered with lice for 3 weeks. We couldn't eradicate them, right? It's just like, okay, that's hospitality. We're going to figure this out, right? That person, please don't come back again. She did multiple times, and it worked out, right? But it's hard to give up those desires and preferences. Or maybe there's a new demographic of people that move into the neighborhood. You're going to start to reach out to them, and they're going to start to show up at church, and maybe they speak a different language. Maybe a song per service or a song once a month, you're going to start to sing a song in a different language just so that way they can feel like the gospel's for them. That's what we've learned to do in our church. We sing one song in a different language every Sunday just to be able to learn to express that the kingdom of God is not French. It's not American. It's multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, because that worship session that we're going to have in Revelation 7 is going to be glorious, right? Or maybe you're going to have to forego certain things in your personal budget to free up resources to see the gospel to go out amongst the least, the last, and the lost. Maybe it means giving up an elder or a couple city groups or a precious couple in the family to go across the ocean to plant a new church here or abroad. Gospel goodbyes are hard. Their loss is felt. You will feel it. Their gap will not be filled easily, and it's totally worth it, right? It's straight up messy stuff that isn't easy, but this is what the mission of God is. It's messy. It's messy missiology, right? Someone needs to write that book, right? But I will never forget one time when I was with a Pakistani pastor who'd passed through Strasbourg, and he was asking me, how are you navigating the challenges of a multicultural community and migrants and all their trauma and that kind of stuff? And I was like, that's kind of like this, right? And he's like, if it's not messy, something's wrong because they're hiding something, right? If it's messy, you're doing something good. And that's exactly what it's been. It's been everything except easy. And so if we're going to bring people, though, into family proximity, we're going to have mess. And we're going to walk into that, and Jesus is going to meet us in it. And so it brings us to this question of cost. Are we going to build Babel churches or Antioch churches? Are we just trying to build our own name, our own brand, our own institution? Or are we releasing our preferences, our people, and possessions for the expansion of his mission? Babel and Antioch. It's so easy to fall into a mentality, right? So we bring this to close. I just want to leave you with two fistfuls of hope, because it's kind of a heavy message, right? It's kind of weighty when you start to consider what God's up to around the world, because the stakes are high and the cost is great. And so the first is this: with all the weightiness of the task of the church before us, the burden is light as long as we're doing it with Jesus, right? If you're staying on point with the mission of God today, or if you start to engage in the mission of God and you start to feel crushed by his mission, then either you are taking on more than Christ asked you to take on, or you're doing it without him, right? Because Jesus made us a promise in Matthew 11:28 that we know well, right? Come to me, all who are burdened and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my mission upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my mission is easy. My mission is light. When we're connected and tethered to Jesus, it's possible. But apart from him, you can do no thing. So when we stay connected to him, it's going to be possible. We're going to only do what God has asked us to carry, not more, and certainly not less. And so take hope in the face of the weighty mission by remaining tethered to Jesus. Because I can tell you from personal experience that when you take on more than Christ asked you to take on, or when you do it apart from Jesus and you try to engage the mission of God without him, then your soul is going to shrivel up, your family is going to fall apart, people around you are going to feel used, and the kingdom's going to suffer. We have no shortage of experiences of that, maybe with our own friends. Maybe some of you experienced that yourself, and that's why you're here, to get healed from that. Or maybe you've just seen it in the news, but that's the reality. And so we have to carry our load, but we have to carry it with Jesus. The second fistful of hope is that this isn't just a text about what God did one day a long time ago, but that's not really how he works anymore, right? It's still happening around the world. Aslan's on the move, right? Since Acts 28. Who would have thought that God would have taken a rural boy from a rural town in western Pennsylvania where there's more cows than people, and I didn't meet my first black or brown person until I was 12 years old, and now I'm in France with a multi-ethnic church. I failed Spanish, and now I speak French fluently, right? It just doesn't happen, right? And now I'm working with a pastor who's named Muhammad, Pastor Muhammad planting an Iranian Afghan church in France. We had 118 Iranians and Afghans come from all over Europe 3 weeks ago for a conference, and they were worshiping in their own language. We invited some professors from Southern Seminary to come and teach in Farsi because they have a theological training in Farsi online that our pastor's been going through. And that happened in France. The historic first ever Iranian church conference in France. It's crazy. It's super small, right? 118 people. It's just a seed of mustard seed, but it's beginning to build and have growth all over the world, right? We're seeing this stuff happen. Who would have thought that this could happen? God's done more with my absence from Africa than my presence there. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. If I had my way, I'd still be there, but I'm not. And so I'm more convinced now than ever that this is his mission, that we were all on mission. That mission is happening from everywhere and to everywhere, that God is committed to his glory spreading to the ends of the earth through the multiplication of disciples and churches, and that it comes at a great cost, and it's completely worth it, right? So when you read the book of Acts, we can't just think of it as this thing that happened once upon a time like a fairy tale. It's not like that anymore. No, but actually it's happening around the world, and God wants to do this through us individually and collectively. Granted, the circumstances, the context, the challenges are going to be different, but the same God that moved his people out of Jerusalem to Antioch is the same one working in France and right here in Franklin. That's reassuring. He's inviting each one of us to ask ourselves, to reevaluate, are we staying on point this morning? We look at the questions up on the screen, we can begin to ask ourselves, whose mission are you on this morning? Right? My idolatry of mission was exposed in Africa, and God's like, come join me on my mission. Right? Whose mission are you actually on? Sometimes we use his mission as a platform for our own. Are each of you on mission? Are you on the sidelines, or are we in the game, finding our spot in our lake, in our pond, fishing faithfully? From where and to where is mission happening? Where's God connecting Franklin City Church around the world? That would be very interesting to see. Are you actively seeking multiplication? Right? Maybe it's just a disciple and investing in someone else. Maybe it's a city group. And you know, there are the sweet moments as a city mission group. We start to grow, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's so good, we don't want to lose it, right? But no, we're actually not losing it. We're sharing it with other people. That's what gets to happen. And you're going to have those gospel goodbyes just here locally. And it's going to be joyful and difficult, but that's the design. And so how are you sharing then in the cost to see the mission forward? Because if we're staying on point, God's going to receive indescribable glory, and you are going to receive an everlasting joy as you see the harvest that God's going to bring forth through our collective efforts. So Franklin City Church, where are you today? Right? It's the question that God asked Adam and Eve in the garden after they sinned, where are you? God knew exactly where they were. The question is, did they know where they were? And so I hope this doesn't make you feel guilty this morning, but I hope it just invites you to realignment, right? There might be a realignment that needs to take place. It might be a big one. It might be just a small one, right? But some of us need to realign today, but some of us need to just rejoice. Like, man, on these points, we're killing it as a family, right? As a church, we're just doing it great. Let's celebrate. So let's realign and let's rejoice at what God's doing. And may God renew us by his grace to stay on point with the mission that he's entrusted to us. So we move in this time of reflection. I just invite you to a time of prayer.